February 1944. Over the North Sea, a B-17 limps toward England with one engine dead and fighters closing fast. The navigator is 22 years old. His crew thinks he's lost. He draws a line across his chart that defies every manual they've memorized. The pilot hesitates. The copilot swears. Behind them, the radio operator hears the Focke-Wulfs gaining altitude. The navigator taps the map once and says they have 90 seconds to decide. The air war over Europe is a geometry problem written in blood and aluminum. Every bomber route is planned weeks in advance by men who have never flown combat. They calculate fuel loads, wind drift, flak corridors, and fighter ranges on tables in London and High Wycombe. The routes are printed, distributed, memorized. They are doctrine. And doctrine in the winter of 1944 is killing thousands. The 8th Air Force has been hammering German industry for 18 months. The losses are staggering. On some missions, 1 in 10 bombers never returns. Crews fly their 25 mission tours, knowing the statistics are against them. They trust their training. They trust their aircraft. And they trust their navigators to follow the routes exactly as drawn, because deviation means confusion. Confusion means scattered formations. Scattered formations means slaughter. Navigation over wartime Europe is not like peacetime flying. There are no radio beacons, no lit runways, no helpful ground stations offering position updates. Everything below is hostile or hidden. Rivers are camouflaged. Roads are decoys. Cities are blacked out or burning. The Germans have even built fake airfields with wooden planes to draw bombs away from real targets. A navigator works in a cramped compartment behind the cockpit, surrounded by charts, dividers, protractors, and a drift meter. He calculates ground speed by watching the Earth slide past through a small window. He measures wind direction by dropping smoke markers and timing their drift. He updates his position every few minutes, plotting courses that account for weather, enemy territory, and the formation's constantly shifting speed. It is mathematics performed in freezing air at 25,000 feet, while flak bursts outside and the aircraft shudders under the weight of 5,000 pounds of bombs. Most navigators are college men. They have studied trigonometry, astronomy, and dead reckoning. They have passed exams. They have logged training hours over the calm fields of Texas and Arizona. They arrive in England with confidence and clean uniforms and no understanding of what the sky over Germany actually demands. The veterans can spot them immediately. They are too precise, too trusting of their instruments, too willing to believe the winds will behave as forecast. The North Sea is where many of them learn the truth. It is a grey void between England and the continent, featureless and unforgiving. In winter, the weather changes every hour. Cloud layers stack from the surface to 30,000 feet. Visibility drops to 0. Ice forms on the wings and inside the cockpit windows. Compasses swing erratically near the metal-heavy bombers. A navigator can lose his position in minutes and never recover it. And if he brings his crew out over the wrong stretch of Dutch or German coast, the flak batteries will correct his mistake permanently. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force has refined its navigation procedures into a system of checkpoints, time hacks, and formation discipline. Lead navigators guide entire groups. Deputy leads fly backup. Every plane is supposed to stay in formation and follow the leaders home. But battle does not respect formation. Engines fail, fighters attack, bombers fall out of line, alone and vulnerable, with a navigator suddenly responsible for finding a safe route back through hundreds of miles of enemy airspace. Some of them manage it. Most do not. The ones who survive learn to improvise, to ignore the manual when the manual no longer applies, to trust their instincts over their instruments when the two conflict. The officers at headquarters do not like improvisers. They like predictable, repeatable, trainable procedures. They like navigators who follow the book. They like routes that look clean on paper. They do not like rookies who redraw the map in pencil and tell a pilot to turn 30 degrees off course because they have a hunch. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. His name was Paul Archer. He grew up in Oregon, in a logging town where the Cascade Mountains cut the horizon into dark triangles. His father worked in the mills. His mother taught piano. Paul was the kind of child who took apart clocks and left the pieces sorted by size on the kitchen table. He was good with systems, good with patterns. He could look at a map and see not just roads and rivers, but relationships, distances, shortcuts, routes that made sense only if you stopped thinking in straight lines. In high school, he ran cross-country, not particularly fast, but efficient. He studied the terrain before every meet, finding paths through the woods that saved 30 seconds over 3 miles. His coach called it cheating. Paul called it navigation. He enrolled at Oregon State in 1940, intending to study forestry. But the war arrived before he finished his degree. In the spring of 1942, he enlisted. The recruiter asked if he was good at math. Paul said he was decent. The recruiter sent him to navigation school. He trained at Mather Field in California, then advanced training at Selman Field in Louisiana. The curriculum was rigorous: celestial navigation, pilotage, dead reckoning, radio direction finding, map reading under blackout conditions. He learned to use a sextant, an astrocompass, and a Norden bomb site's auxiliary navigation mode. He was adequate. Not brilliant, but steady. His instructors noted that he asked unusual questions. He wanted to know what happened when 2 methods disagreed, what to trust when the compass and the stars gave different answers, how to navigate when every instrument failed at once. They told him to follow procedure. Procedure would keep him alive. Paul graduated in November 1943 and was assigned to a B-17 crew forming up at Pyote Army Airfield in Texas. The pilot was a rangy Oklahoman named Harlan Voss. The co-pilot was from New Jersey. The bombardier was a former accountant. The radio operator had worked in a Chicago rail yard. They trained together for 2 months, flying practice missions over the Southwest. Paul navigated them competently. He made no major errors, but the crew noticed he spent a lot of time staring at maps when he should have been socializing. He traced routes with his finger. He drew alternate courses in the margins. He asked the pilot hypothetical questions. What if we lost 2 engines over the channel? What if the formation scattered? What if the weather closed in and we had to find another airfield? Voss liked the questions. The co-pilot thought Paul was overthinking. The bombardier joked that the rookie navigator was planning to rewrite Air Force doctrine. Paul just kept drawing lines. In January 1944, they shipped out to England. Their base was near Deopham Green in Norfolk. The runways were pierced steel planking. The barracks were cold. The skies were gray and low, and every morning brought the sound of engines warming up for another mission. Paul flew his first combat sortie on January 18th. The target was a factory complex near Oschersleben, deep in Germany. The flak was heavy. 2 bombers in their group went down. Paul kept his charts updated, his calculations precise. They made it home. He flew 5 more missions in 3 weeks. Each time he followed the routes exactly as briefed. Each time he watched bombers fall out of formation and vanish into clouds, their navigators lost or dead or overwhelmed. And each time he wondered if there was a better way. The regulations said to follow the planned route, but the regulations assumed clear skies, accurate forecasts, and no battle damage. Paul had yet to see a mission where all 3 applied. On February 7th, the crew was assigned a mission to Brunswick. Paul studied the route during the briefing. It was a long, looping path designed to avoid the heaviest flak belts. It made sense on the map, but it also added 30 minutes to the return flight. 30 minutes of fuel, 30 minutes of exposure, 30 minutes during which a damaged bomber might not survive. Paul traced an alternate route in pencil, a straight line across the Frisian Islands and out over the North Sea. It cut the distance by 40 miles, but it passed directly over 2 known flak positions and a Luftwaffe base. He showed it to Voss that night in the barracks. The pilot looked at it for a long time. "Why would we do that?" Voss asked. "Because if we take damage," Paul said, "we won't have enough fuel for the long way home." Voss folded the map and handed it back. "Let's hope we don't take damage." Paul tucked the map into his flight bag, but he didn't erase the line. The mission to Brunswick launched on the morning of February 10th. 36 bombers from their group, part of a larger stream, headed deep into central Germany. The weather was poor. Cloud cover obscured the ground from the English coast onward. The temperature at altitude was 40 below zero. Paul worked his charts as they climbed over the North Sea. He logged their checkpoints, calculated wind drift, and updated the pilot every 10 minutes. The formation was tight. Everything was going according to plan. They crossed into German airspace at 26,000 feet. The flak started immediately. Black bursts dotted the sky in clusters, each one a few hundred feet across, shrapnel slicing through the air in invisible waves. The bomber shuddered with each nearby hit. Paul could hear the metal pinging against the fuselage. The fighters came next. Focke-Wulf 190s, diving out of the sun. They made passes from the front, cannons flashing, then rolled away before the gunners could track them. One bomber in the formation took a direct hit to the cockpit and fell away, spiraling. Another lost an engine and dropped back, trailing smoke. Paul kept his head down and updated his position. They were 12 minutes from the initial point, the start of the bomb run. Once they began the run, the pilot would hand control to the bombardier. They would fly straight and level for 6 minutes, unable to maneuver, while flak and fighters tore into the formation. It was the most dangerous part of every mission. The bombardier called ready. Voss steadied the aircraft. The bomb bay doors opened, adding drag and slowing them down. The flak intensified. Paul could feel the concussions through the airframe. One burst was close enough to rattle his instruments off the navigation table. They dropped their bombs at 11:47 hours. The aircraft lurched upward as 5,000 pounds left the bay. The doors closed. Voss banked left, following the lead bomber toward the rally point. And then the number 3 engine exploded. Paul felt it before he heard it. A violent vibration, then a shudder, then the sudden yaw as the aircraft pulled to the right. Voss and the copilot fought the controls. The flight engineer reported fire in the engine nacelle. Paul looked out the window and saw flames streaming back along the wing. The engine's propeller was windmilling, adding drag. The fire continued for 30 seconds, then went out, starved of fuel after the engineer pulled the emergency shutoff. But the damage was done. They had lost a quarter of their power and gained significant drag from the dead propeller. They could not keep up with the formation. Voss tried for 5 minutes, pushing the remaining engines to maximum continuous power, but the gap widened. The other bombers pulled ahead, shrinking into the haze. Within 10 minutes, Paul's aircraft was alone. A straggler, the term every crew feared. German fighters hunted stragglers. They were easy targets. Separated from the protective firepower of the formation, a lone bomber was vulnerable from every angle. Dozens of B-17s had been lost this way, picked apart over Germany by relentless attacks. Voss called for a heading home. Paul bent over his chart. They were 180 miles from the English coast. The planned route would take them northwest, skirting the flak zones, rejoining the bomber stream if possible. But the number 3 engine was gone, and the number 4 engine was running rough, its oil pressure dropping. The flight engineer said it might last an hour, maybe less. Paul did the math. At their current speed, with the drag from the dead engine, the planned route would take 90 minutes. They would run out of power over the North Sea, 30 miles from England. He pulled out the alternate route he had drawn weeks earlier, the straight line across the Frisian Islands. It was 60 miles shorter. It would save 15 minutes. But it went directly over German defenses. Paul called the pilot on the intercom. He explained the fuel situation. He explained the distances. He said they had 2 choices: follow doctrine and ditch in the North Sea, or take the short route and risk the flak. Voss asked how bad the flak would be. Paul said he didn't know. The intelligence maps showed active batteries, but not their density or accuracy. It could be a light barrage, or it could be a killing field. The copilot interrupted. He said the short route was suicide. The flight engineer agreed. The radio operator said they should try to make the long route work. Maybe they'd get lucky with the winds. Paul said the winds were against them. There was silence on the intercom. Outside, the sky was empty. No fighters yet, but that would change. Voss asked Paul how sure he was about the numbers. Paul said he was sure. Voss told him to give him the heading. Paul drew the line carefully, using a straight edge and a grease pencil. The route cut across the Frisian Islands at their narrowest point, then straight out over the North Sea to the English coast. It avoided the major cities, but passed near 2 smaller towns, marked on the intelligence charts as flak zones. He measured the distance, 120 miles. At their reduced speed, 70 minutes. He calculated fuel consumption with 3 engines. The engineer had reported 60 gallons remaining in the compromised engine's fuel lines, now being redistributed. Total usable fuel, 420 gallons. Consumption rate, 6 gallons per minute. 70 minutes meant 420 gallons. 0 margin. If they encountered headwinds, they would fall short. If they had to maneuver to evade fighters, they would fall short. If anything else went wrong, they would fall short. But the long route was impossible. Paul had checked it twice. The math was absolute. He gave Voss the heading. The pilot turned the aircraft southwest toward the coast. The co-pilot marked the time. The navigator went back to his charts. They descended to 18,000 feet to reduce fuel consumption. The air was still brutally cold, but the engines ran more efficiently in the denser atmosphere. The flight engineer watched the gauges like a man counting his last breaths. Paul tracked their progress using pilotage and dead reckoning. The clouds below were solid, hiding the ground. He could not see landmarks. He had to rely on time, speed, and heading. If his calculations were off by even a few degrees, they would miss the gap in the islands and fly directly over the heaviest defenses. 20 minutes into the new route, the radio operator reported contacts behind them. Fighters, climbing to intercept. Voss pushed the throttles forward. The aircraft accelerated slightly, the remaining engines roaring. The fuel consumption rate increased. Paul recalculated. They now had 65 minutes of fuel remaining. The fighters closed to 4 miles. The tail gunner identified them as FW-190s, 3 of them in a loose trail formation. Voss asked Paul how long until they reached the coast. Paul said 30 minutes. The co-pilot said the fighters would catch them in 10. Paul stared at the chart. There was nothing he could do about the fighters, but the route, if he could refine the route, save even a few miles. He noticed something, a small notation on the chart, added in pencil during a previous mission. A British rescue ship stationed in the North Sea to pick up downed air crews. Its position was marked 60 miles off the Dutch coast. If they could reach the ship, they would be within range of RAF air patrols. The fighters might break off, but the ship was 5 degrees south of their current heading. The deviation would add 3 miles. 3 miles they could not afford. Paul looked at the fuel gauges, looked at the chart, looked at the notation. He did the math. Again, if they turned south, they would add 2 minutes to the flight. But if the fighters broke off, Voss could reduce power and save fuel. It was a gamble. If the fighters did not break off, the detour would kill them. Paul called Voss and explained. The pilot did not hesitate. He banked 5 degrees south. The fighters continued to close. 3 miles, 2 miles, the gunners called ready. And then the radio operator picked up a transmission. RAF Spitfires scrambled from an advanced base, vectoring toward the rescue ship's position. They were 12 minutes out. The German fighters heard it too. Paul watched through the waist window as they broke off, diving back toward the continent. Voss leveled the aircraft and reduced power. The fuel flow dropped. Paul checked his watch and recalculated. They now had 58 minutes of fuel and 55 minutes to the English coast. They were going to make it. The Frisian Islands appeared below as a break in the clouds, narrow strips of sand and grass, dotted with German radar stations and flak batteries. Paul could see the guns tracking them, barrels elevating. He counted 6 positions. The first bursts came at 18,000 feet. Black puffs, slightly behind and below. The gunners were compensating for range and altitude, adjusting their fire. Voss held the heading. The bomber flew straight, maintaining speed. To maneuver would cost fuel they did not have. The flak intensified. Paul felt the aircraft shudder as shrapnel passed close. One burst detonated directly ahead, and they flew through the smoke. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. The bombardier, in the nose, reported damage to the plexiglass, cracks spreading across the panels. The copilot said the hydraulic pressure was fluctuating. The flight engineer said the number 4 engine's oil pressure had dropped again. Paul updated his position. They were over the narrowest part of the island chain. 2 more minutes, and they would be clear. The flak followed them. The German gunners were skilled, adjusting rapidly. A burst detonated 50 feet below the left wing, lifting the aircraft violently. Another hit 20 feet to the right, and then they were past. The islands fell behind. The North Sea opened ahead, gray and infinite. The flak stopped. Paul exhaled. He had been holding his breath without realizing it. He checked the chart, marked their position, and calculated the remaining distance. 40 miles to the English coast, 32 minutes. The flight engineer reported 35 minutes of fuel remaining. It was going to be close. Voss reduced power further, leaning the mixture to the edge of safety. The bomber slowed to 160 miles per hour, barely above stall speed. The co-pilot watched the airspeed indicator like a man on a tightrope. Paul tracked their progress using time and heading. The clouds below began to break, revealing patches of dark water. The wind was calm. No turbulence. Every small advantage mattered now. At 20 minutes out, the number 4 engine coughed. The oil pressure had dropped to 0. The engineer feathered the propeller, stopping its rotation to reduce drag. They were down to 2 engines. Voss told the crew to prepare for ditching. The radio operator transmitted their position to air-sea rescue. The gunners opened the waist windows, ready to deploy life rafts. Paul recalculated. 2 engines, reduced power, maximum fuel economy. 20 minutes of fuel, 18 minutes to the coast. They might still make it. The bomber droned on, painfully slow, suspended between sky and sea. Paul watched the clock, watched the chart, watched the engineer's fuel gauges as the needles crept toward empty. 15 minutes, 12 minutes, 10. The coast appeared ahead, a thin gray line barely distinguishable from the water. Paul marked it on the chart. Landfall, 8 minutes of fuel remaining. Voss kept the nose level. The co-pilot called out altitudes, 16,000 feet, 14,000. They were descending slowly, trading altitude for distance. The coastline grew sharper. Details emerged, cliffs, fields, a lighthouse. 5 minutes of fuel, 3 minutes to the nearest airfield. The number 2 engine coughed, sputtered, caught again. 2 minutes of fuel. Paul saw the airfield, a single runway, pierced steel planking, an emergency landing strip for damaged bombers. It was 10 miles inland. 1 minute of fuel. Voss turned toward the runway. The gear came down. The bomber descended through 1,000 feet. The engine sputtered again, running on vapors. They crossed the airfield boundary at 200 feet. The engine quit. The propeller windmilled, then stopped. The bomber glided the last 100 yards and hit the runway hard. The tires blew on impact. The aircraft skidded, veered left, and came to rest in the grass alongside the runway. Silence. Paul looked at the fuel gauges. Both needles rested on 0. The flight engineer confirmed it. The tanks were dry. They had made it with nothing to spare. The crew climbed out onto the wet grass. No one spoke for a long time. They stood beside the bomber, looking at the dead engines, the shredded cowling, the cracks in the nose glazing. The aircraft would never fly again. But they were alive. An RAF officer drove out in a jeep to meet them. He asked how they had made it back on 2 engines. Voss pointed at Paul and said the Navigator had rewritten the route. The officer looked skeptical. He said the standard route was designed for maximum safety. Paul explained the fuel calculations, the geometry, the risk analysis. The officer listened, then asked to see the charts. Paul showed him. The officer studied the lines, the notations, the alternate route drawn in pencil. He asked why Paul had deviated from the briefed course. Paul said because the briefed course would have killed them. The officer took the charts and said he would pass them to the navigation section at headquarters. He did not say whether Paul would be commended or court-martialed. The crew returned to their base 3 days later. Their aircraft was scrapped. They were assigned a new bomber and resumed operations, but word of the shortcut spread. Other navigators began studying Paul's route. They saw the logic. The shorter distance over the most dangerous terrain balanced against the longer route through less defended but more fuel-intensive airspace. It was a calculated risk. But in a war where every mission was a calculated risk, Paul's route offered a new option, a way home for bombers that would otherwise be lost. The navigation section at 8th Air Force headquarters reviewed the charts. They interviewed Paul, asked him to explain his reasoning. He walked them through the math, the fuel consumption rates, the wind corrections, the decision points. They did not officially adopt his route, but they did not forbid it either. They classified it as an alternate procedure available to navigators in extremis. By spring, dozens of damaged bombers had used variations of Paul's shortcut. Some made it, some did not. But the ones that made it owed their survival to a rookie navigator who had trusted his math over doctrine. Paul flew 15 more missions. He never deviated from the briefed routes again unless circumstances demanded it. But he always carried his penciled alternates, drawn in the margins of his charts, ready if needed. In May, his crew completed their tour. They rotated back to the United States. Paul was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for navigation under combat conditions. The citation did not mention the shortcut. It mentioned only his skill and composure. But the other navigators knew. They had seen the charts. They had flown the routes. They knew that one man's refusal to accept doctrine as infallible had opened a door. a door that led home. Paul Archer returned to Oregon in June 1944. He finished his degree in forestry and spent 30 years working for the U.S. Forest Service, mapping trails and managing timberlands in the Cascades. He married, raised 2 children, and rarely spoke about the war. His charts were filed away in Air Force archives. His shortcut was never formally documented in training manuals. But navigators who flew in the final year of the war knew the story. They passed it along to the next generation, a piece of oral history in a service that prized written procedure. In the decades after the war, aviation navigation evolved. Radio beacons returned, then radar, then GPS. The skills Paul had used, dead reckoning, pilotage, celestial navigation, became obsolete. Modern navigators punch coordinates into computers and let satellites guide them, but the principle remained. The willingness to see past the plan when the plan no longer serves, the courage to draw a new line when the old one leads to failure. Paul died in 1996 at the age of 74. His obituary mentioned his forestry career and his service in the war. It did not mention the mission to Brunswick or the fuel-starved flight home. But in the archives at Maxwell Air Force Base, his charts still exist. The penciled lines are faint now, the paper yellowed, but the geometry is still there. The logic still holds. 120 miles across the Frisian Islands, 70 minutes of flight time, 0 margin for error, and a crew that made it home because their navigator trusted mathematics more than doctrine and courage more than fear. War is filled with moments like this, small decisions made in freezing cockpits by young men with pencils and charts that ripple forward through time. They are not celebrated with monuments or parades. They are recorded in logbooks and fuel consumption tables and survival rates that ticked a fraction of a percent higher. But they are the architecture of victory, the quiet insistence that there must be a better way, and the will to find it when everything argues otherwise. Paul Archer's shortcut saved one crew on one mission, but the idea behind it, that courage and logic together can reshape even the most rigid system, saved many more. And that idea, drawn in pencil on a folded chart over the North Sea, remains.